All right, let's talk about the Hindu joint family in India. It's a huge deal, legally speaking. But here's the thing that's always fascinated me. How can one single set of ancient laws lead to two totally different ways of handling things like property and inheritance? It's a real puzzle, right? Well, today we're going to unravel exactly that.
So, here's our game plan. We'll start by looking at how these laws even came to be. Then, we'll get a clear definition of what a Hindu joint family actually is. After that, we'll dive into the two big legal schools, compare them head to head, and even check out a real-life court case to see how this stuff works in practice. Sound good?
Okay, first things first. Where did all this come from? We're talking about a legal system with roots stretching back literally thousands of years. But here's the thing, law can't just be frozen in time, right? It has to evolve, it has to adapt.
And that brings us right back to our big question. How is it possible that a son in, say, Bengal, has completely different property rights than a son in Maharashtra, even though they're both under the same umbrella of Hindu law? The whole secret, the key to it all, is interpretation.
So it all kicked off with these ancient texts, right? The Shruti and Smriti. But they were dense, complex stuff. They weren't exactly user-friendly. So scholars started writing commentaries to explain them, to expand on them, and sometimes, even to tweak them a bit. And here's the really crucial part. These commentaries weren't written in a vacuum. They were designed to make the ancient laws fit with the local customs and the way people actually lived all across India. And because different regions had different customs, you got different commentaries, and voila. That's how we ended up with the two major schools we're diving into, Mitishara and Dayabhaga.
Yeah, this process of interpretation is everything. Just think about it. You have these ancient texts as a foundation. Then, legal thinkers and scholars come along and build on top of that foundation, creating these commentaries that sync up the old laws with what's happening on the ground with the local environment. It was that act of translation, of harmonization, that created these two completely distinct schools of thought.
Okay, so before we jump into the nitty-gritty of how these schools are different, we need to be super clear on what they're actually, governing. So let's nail down the definition. What exactly is a Hindu joint family?
Basically, you can think of it as this big, extended family unit. It includes all the male descendants who can trace their line all the way back to one common male ancestor. It's not just a nuclear family, it's this continuous, multi-generational thing.
So let's break that down. Who's in the club? Well, you start with one common male ancestor. He's the starting point. Then you got all of his male descendants, his sons, his grandsons, his great-grandsons, and on and on. And then you also include the wives and widows of all those men, plus any unmarried daughters. That whole group, that's the Hindu joint family.
And look, this isn't just some quaint cultural idea. This is hard-coded into the law. In fact, the legal presumption is that a Hindu family is a joint family unless you can prove it's not. It's seen as the default, the fundamental building block of society.
All right, so we've got our family unit down. Now it's time to get into the two different legal playbooks that govern it, the Mitishara and the Dayabhaga schools.
Now, these schools cover a lot of ground in family law, but the one thing, the single biggest point where they completely diverge, the issue that really defines them, is how they deal with property rights inside the family. And just look at this. It's pretty stark, isn't it? The Mitishara school is the law of the land for most of India, like a huge majority. But then you've got the Dayabhaga school, which is concentrated mostly in the east. Think Bengal, Assam. This isn't just a line on a map. This regional split has had massive, real-world consequences for families for hundreds of years.
Okay, let's get right to the main event. What are the big differences between these two systems? It's time for a head-to-head comparison.
Okay, if you remember one thing, let it be this. This is the absolute core difference. Under the Mitishara school, a son gets a stake in the ancestral property by birth. The moment he's born, boom, he's a co-owner. But under the Dayabhaga school, nope. A son has zero rights to that property while his father is alive. He only gets it through inheritance after his father's death. By birth versus on death. That is the fundamental split.
And, this one core difference creates this whole domino effect of other differences. For example, in the Mitishara school, property rights are all about survivorship. That means when a co-owner, they're called co-parceners, dies, his share doesn't go to his own kids, it gets absorbed back into the pool for the surviving members. Dayabhaga is much more like what most of us think of as inheritance. Your share passes down to your heirs. And this one change affects everything. How important joint property is versus personal property, and especially the rights of women.
And just when you think you've got it figured out, there's another twist. The Mitishara school, the really dominant one,
isn't just one single system. Oh no! It has its own regional sub-schools. You've got different versions in different places, each with its own local flavor and customs. For instance, they might have totally different rules about something as specific as whether a widow needs her late husband's permission to adopt a son. It just gets more and more fascinating.
All right. So this isn't just some dry legal theory, right? These rules have had huge, real-world impacts on people's lives. To see what I mean, let's take a look at a really famous case from all the way back in 1868. It's a perfect example of how the courts had to wrestle with all this complexity. So here's the rundown. The ruler of this big estate called Ramnad dies, and he has no kids, no heir. His widow wants to continue the family line, so she adopts a son. Now here's the catch. She didn't get her husband's direct permission before he died, but she did get the okay from his extended family. So the big question was, is this adoption even legal? This got challenged, and the case went all the way to the top. And the verdict? The court said, yes, the adoption was totally valid. Why? Because it followed the specific local customs of that region's subschool of Mitikshara law, which said consent from the family was good enough.
I mean, think about that. This was way back in 1868, and this case really locked in a super important principle, that living, breathing local customs could be just as powerful and just as valid as the ancient written texts when it comes to making law.
And that's really the key takeaway here. This case is the perfect snapshot of the whole system in action. You see how judges couldn't just read an old book. They had to be like legal anthropologists, you know? They had to weigh the authority of the ancient texts against the reality of how people were actually living their lives to figure out what was fair.
So, let's wrap this all up. What are the big things to remember? First, Hindu law isn't some dusty old relic. It's a living, evolving system. At its heart is the Hindu joint family. The two big schools of thought, Mitikshara and Dayabhaga, hinge on that one massive question: do property rights start at birth or after death? And as that old court case showed us, these aren't just ideas on a page. They've shaped real lives for a very, very long time.
And all of this leaves us with a really big question for today. These incredibly detailed legal schools were designed for a very different world, a patriarchal agrarian society. So the challenge for modern India is a huge one. How do you balance this ancient, deeply ingrained legal heritage with today's values? You know, things like gender equality and the rise of smaller nuclear families. It's a fascinating problem, and it's one that's still being worked out right now. What do you think is the right path forward?